Well, thank you for inviting me and for joining me in this discussion. I already began with a correction that actually the title, the working title is called, I'm just calling it Black Gay History Before Stonewall. And but it does talk about respectability and so forth. And this talk is drawing on the first third of a book project that I'm working on. And the book is talking about the construction of black gay identity from the 1960s to the 1980s. And this section is really trying to look at iterations of identity and constraint in the culture of black queerness at this before the rise of the gay liberation movement. And so the subsequent chapters talk about black participation in gay liberation and also the rise of black activist politics, sort of black identity activism in the late 1970s and the 1980s. So, black gay history before Stonewall. Some of you may not be entirely familiar with the terms in this title, black gay history before Stonewall. So I'll begin with a few points of clarification. First, both the terms black and gay are used advisedly. I'm well aware, and in my research I investigate, the constructedness of categories of difference and how these apparently unified and trans-historical essences of race and sexuality are in fact social projects and cultural formations that carry on through the interpolation of a kind of personality or subjectivity. As demonstrated in the writing of Michel Foucault or the recent explosion of scholarship in queer studies in the United States, the categories of homosexual and heterosexual appear at particularly contingent moments. And now we're beginning to see how their expression varies by intersecting categories of gender, race, ethnicity, as well as nationality and location. It is less common in U.S. historiography to write about race in terms of the more constructionist point of view. Fewer books focus on the construction of black identity in African American historiography than more popular themes such as the history of the freedom struggle or African American intellectuals. But in the end, I would say that today most African American historians agree that race is also a social construction, and that whiteness and blackness are after-the-fact attributions, or what Franz Fanon conceived of as the wounds of the encounter, colonization, and psychological domination. As a number of U.S. historians have pointed out, the ideology of race came into existence as a major justification for domination in the 16th century for the slave trade, and in the 17th century and 18th century for the legal regulation of slavery, and in the racialized exclusions in modern democracies in the 18th century, and most significantly, a resurgence of a kind of racism in the American South, even after the repudiation of racialism after World War II, and so that under this new system of Jim Crow and disenfranchisement in the late 19th century, new racial formations continued into modern America right up into the civil rights movement. Another term in my talk that many of you may not be familiar with is Stonewall, or what is indicated by the chronology of before Stonewall or post-Stonewall. The Stonewall Inn was a gay-friendly bar in New York that in 1969 experienced yet another police raid. But this time, rather than meekly acquiescing to the arrest, a number of young patrons fought back. After 1969, for a few years, committed activists proclaimed a sexual revolution in the name of Stonewall. They organized fronts, started up newspapers, went out to bars and bathhouses in unprecedented numbers. Though historians of homosexuality have moved away from pinning the entire gay revolution on this single historical event, what is clear is that this chronology of gay history has to have some relationship to African American history and race relations. So one of the problems that I'm working on is how to connect the history of the civil rights movement to the history of the gay rights movement. And I liken it to a kind of a balancing act in which at one moment I'm sort of looking at traditionally African-American sources, and at the next minute I'm at the local community archive sort of digging through to see if I can find representations of questions of race and representations of African-American men. To conceive of black gay history is to grapple with analytical problems of multiple identities, intersections of domination, a poetics of desire and racial transgression, and so forth. And in my own reading, I've recently rediscovered the work of Erving Goffman, the pioneering interactionist sociologist who explored the institutional experience of the marginalized in the operation of everyday life. Casting his ethnographic accounts of the marginalized in terms of shame and embarrassment, Goffman compared how various categories of stigmatized individuals sought to control their image by concealing information about their status, and studied the presentation of the self of the mental patient, the alcoholic, the criminal, alongside the homosexual, and in a few instances, the black subject. Goffman divided identity categories first into virtual and actual, and then classified them as one of three main types: the physical abomination, like a disability; defect of character, and here he's talking about homosexuality as well as a mental disorder, and tribal affiliation. And here he's talking about questions of race or questions of religion. So Goffman argued that the stigma had a dual nature that was manipulated by the subject, and that therefore it was subject to a kind of management in mixed situations. And he developed an argument on the dynamics of identity that today is, I think, considered crucial to a kind of queer theories. He argued, quote, that the stigmatized and the normal are part of each other. If one can prove vulnerable, it must be expected that the other can too. So this is sort of 1963, looking at a range of categories of deviance and stigmatization. At one point, speaking of institutions, Goffman considers the theme of passing and points to the moment when a patient at an institution admits to a visitor that he is an inpatient, not another visitor or a staff member. And that becomes the moment when the patient, quote unquote, comes out. And a footnote to this section, Goffman not only pointed out that comparable coming out occurs in the homosexual world, when a person finally comes frankly to present himself to a gay gathering, unquote. But Goffman also mentions James Baldwin's 1956 gay novel Giovanni's Room as a, quote, a good fictionalized treatment of this process, unquote. So, a number of queer theorists, Ruth Butler, Heather Love, Sedgwick, address these questions of performativity and the relationship between sex and gender, and less so on questions of race. But I found rereading Goffman very useful by thinking about how all of these subjects shared a kind of position, a designation as pathological and as abnormal. And I want to argue in the remainder of my discussion today that that the dominant context for signifying and identifying and for being stigmatized as a black gay man in the 1960s was that of pathology. I would like to examine three sequential overlapping contexts or cases for the iteration of a black gay figure, each one having some dimension of this pathology, not only to understand the deployment of homophobia, but also to understand how it is possible to reverse this pathology and to present a kind of an identity or a subjectivity through this pathology. So the first section has to do with Jet magazine and representations of black queer identity in the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s. In 1945, the Johnson Publishing Company, the largest black publisher in the United States, issued its first issue of Ebony magazine, while the influence of the traditional African-American weekly newspapers gradually declined. In 1951, Johnson converted its Negro Digest into Jet magazine, reportedly to feel the need for what Johnson termed, quote, a convenient-sized magazine that will summarize the week's biggest Negro news in a well-organized, easy-to-read format. An advertising journal noted that Ebony had achieved a circulation of around 500,000, while Jet debuted with a circulation of 100,000. By the 1950s, the new dominant white-oriented domesticity, suburbanization, and return to traditional gender roles had influenced black popular culture, and yet Jett seemed to promote America's new sexual liberalism and with a certain kind of daring, printing stories on masturbation, sexual infidelity, stag parties, and recent discoveries of science about sexual behavior. They ran quizzes for readers to test their knowledge of sex. Did masturbation cause insanity? Were Negro women less affectionate than white women? In another volume, a reporter queried, quote, are men more romantic than women? Another piece suggested that, quote, sexiness is the new trend. And yet alongside this kind of frank sexual discourse that you see in article after article in Jett magazine, there were stories of danger. For it was common knowledge that in some areas of the nation, even the slightest expression of sexual desire across the color line endangered individuals and threatened communities. So that the emergence of lynching in the late 19th century and the policing of miscegenation, the refusal to allow black people and white people to cross the color line, particularly in the South, was also a story that was printed frequently and was a common knowledge both in the culture and in the popular press. A high mark of this anti-miscegenation sentiment was the national tragedy of the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955. As you may know, Till was a 14-year-old boy who was murdered in Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman. In the case, Jett not only published explicit or photos of the corpse, but also followed up on the prosecution of the case, which ended up being a political trial that saw a quick acquittal of the two murderers. They also ran several stories of Till-like incidents in which black boys were attacked for allegedly expressing desire for other white girls, including a murder of an 11-year-old boy in Mississippi, referred to as, quote, the second child slain. Another article announced another Till case, except for police action. But in Jett, there was also the pleasure of defying lynch law and representing the sexual transgression. And Jett frequently ran stories about miscegenation, reporting, for example, that, quote, a Harlem sex party was raided, unquote, involving a 5-day-long whiskey sex party of 3 escaped white convicts and 3 Negro women. Another story reported on a so-called sex lottery racket in which laborers purchased tickets in Wichita, Kansas to win a sensational prize, quote, a weekend at a mountain resort with a white girl. So stories of these sort of transgressions often included an interracial angle. Quote, a beauteous blonde ex-belly dancer, now a photographer's model, and her Negro lover had their photos featured in a story about an alleged robbery in Detroit, while another blurb described, quote, Negroes jailed for interracial sex orgies. In another case, reporters followed up on the convalescence of a black man who had been castrated in the South, focusing on how he had relied on the support of his wife to recuperate and return to his role as their father. So, fascinating reports of interracial sex and romance provided a space for sexual transgression in the black public sphere. At the same time, the intersecting stories of white supremacist sexual violence served to deploy danger and sharpen cultural perceptions of sexual taboo. Perhaps these stories of sexual danger appeared more frequently and weighed heavily on the black sexual imaginary. I haven't decided yet, but the connections between sex and danger seem palpable. Eluding sexual danger is a main theme in the history of sexuality, and particularly African American sexuality. I would argue that a shared set of performances shared between African American cultures and queer identities was the trope of passing, ranging from the temporary illusion of detection to the long-term refusal of blackness or claiming to be white. So at the same time, Jett featured stories of light-skinned black men and women who had passed as white for employment, to become married, for fun. In the 1950s, however, Jett was also reporting that passing was becoming passé and that more light-skinned men and women preferred to claim their place in the black community. At the same time, perhaps the longest queer tradition in black metropolitan areas was the so-called drag ball, famously staged in Harlem, with black and white men dressed to present themselves as real women for appreciative, racially mixed audiences. In 1952, Jet utilized the term gay to refer to the gayest Halloween ball in a club in a hotel, including more than 2,000 masqueraders and spectators and some 50 impersonators, and reported that the gay affair named the Queen, in this case at Finney's Club in Chicago's Pershing Hotel. In what seemed an accepted or at least familiar tradition of imitating celebrities, they reported on lookalikes of Josephine Baker, Mae West, Lena Horne. Not surprisingly, this affair was also racially mixed, and indeed it was reported that some of the white impersonators equaled the Negro ones. In another event in New York City, the performers reportedly, quote, did such an excellent job of mimicking women that sometimes even the judges are confused. In the 1952 Jet story, Jet announced that a number of homosexuals, or males who prefer intimacies with other males, had reached more than 8 million. But this news of homosexuality presented, quote, America with the biggest psychosexual problem of modern times, unquote. Writing of the maladjustment of inmates in prison populations, or employing the term perversion, some stories legitimated anti-gay perceptions, and yet the new tone was that of scientific authority, counting and classifying in a more objective manner. So, as you're reading these reels and reels of Jet Weekly, on the one hand, you're seeing this kind of the story of the criminal, the story of the scandal, and then of the sort of this tradition of inversion, the drag dance that's going back to the Harlem Renaissance and before, and the intersection of of danger is seen in these connections between racial crossings and sexual crossings. And one of the moments where you begin to see change in a positive light, I would say, is the introduction of sexology. And the ways in which, and nobody has really talked about this, and we understand that the rise of sexology is very important in constructing and reconstructing the identity, but its impact in the African American community and the ways and how, if it's liberal or repressive, hasn't been talked about. And as you may know, Kinsey's second study in particular did include African American subjects. And Kinsey went to Howard University and talked about sexology. And the reporting on the Kinsey report was significant in Jet. So in the press there were complaints that Kinsey had underutilized black female subjects in this study, and yet Jet pointed out that because of the new recognition of female desire, quote, husbands are becoming more and more aware that double standards and sex morals have all but disappeared. Another article also reported that nearly 1/5 of all women, about 19%, have homosexual contacts at some time in their lives. Again, following Kinsey's discovery of the pervasiveness of homosexuality, Jet reported that the traditional stereotypes, quote, the simpering hipped gait and effeminate characteristics were the result of archaic laws and inadequate scientific research, implying that more knowledge would dispel the old unflattering myths and refute the concept of, quote, third sex feelings. So although historians have long studied the impact of sexology on homosexuality, few have looked at these disparate impacts and the ways in which, if you're reading along in Jet magazine, it has a liberalizing effect, I would argue. And then you begin to see a reversal in terms of the impact of social science in the African American community. And this reversal happens in 1965 as part of the controversy around the Moynihan Report. The leaking of the Moynihan Report in 1965 signaled a sharp increase in in a kind of defensive discourse in the politics of respectability. Going back to E. Franklin Frazier and Du Bois, there had been a tradition of African-American social scientists refuting racist discourses that African-Americans were inherently more licentious, that men were less dedicated to their wives because there were single-headed households and there was more delinquency. And this discourse is being responded to by African-American social scientists who are attempting to explain deviations in family patterns and in the settlement, in black urban settlements, going back to the 1920s and 30s. And the Moynihan Report is 50 pages of analysis, data that was pulled together by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who at the time was an assistant in the Department of Labor. And he was charged with studying the family in order to inform the president on the next stage of the Civil Rights Movement. That there was the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65 had been passed, and then there was a growing recognition that the crisis was now in the North, and there was a lack of opportunity. And so he was working on this report, and he decided he decided that the problem of the Negro was the deterioration, quote unquote, the deterioration of the Negro family, and that the family was the fundamental source of weakness in the African American community. According to Moynihan, it may be speculated that it was the Negro male who was most humiliated. The male was more likely to use public facilities, which rapidly became segregated once the process began. And just as important, segregation and the submissiveness it exacts is surely more destructive to the male personality than the female personality. And in an oft-quoted phrase, Moynihan declared, quote, that the very essence of the male animal, from the bantam rooster to the four-star general, is distraught. Indeed, in 19th century America, a particular type of exaggerated male boastfulness became almost a national style. Not so for the Negro male. The, quote-unquote, sassy nigger, unquote, was lynched. So, though rarely mentioned in the vast literature on the report, the controversy that it generated once it was leaked, a number of theorists at the time explicitly raised the question of black men succumbing to homosexuality. Social scientists had documented cases in which black youth of broken homes attempted to substitute their groups or gangs for a normal family life, resulting in what one study referred to as sexual confusion. It argued that, quote, extensive homosexuality is institutionally part of the gang life, and that, quote, the subsequent insistent masculinity protests, and this is of the black gang members, were too much to be anything other than necessary reassurance against self-doubts. Moynihan also consulted Harvard social scientist Thomas Pettigrew, who had argued that prejudice and ghettos were responsible for a whole range of mental problems. According to a digest of his notes in the Moynihan papers, quote, the effects of the father-absent families are to be seen in homicide, schizophrenia, and homosexuality. So although Moynihan in the report didn't actually use the word gay, it was in his diagnosis of all of the multiple problems of the matriarchal family, it was clear that this was one implication, that not having the father home and having a too strong mother could lead to this emasculation, which is a word that he uses, and that this had some kind of relationship to a problem of homosexuality. So, for example, in 1966, the year after the report was leaked, Ebony magazine ran a series of opinion pieces about sexuality, dating a sexual revolution to the post-war studies by Kinsey. The author, Chicago psychiatrist Kermit Mellinger, observed that the civil rights movement had enhanced the self-esteem of women and their erotic freedom, and yet cautioned that although, quote, the civil rights revolution is more of a black revolution, the sexual revolution tends to be more of a white revolution. Then Mellinger went on to argue that both girls and boys brought up in the matriarchal family climate find it difficult to assume a mature masculine or feminine identification. In many instances, the son will abandon any attempt to free himself from the tyrannical rule of the mother. He will simply identify with her, give up the battle, and resolve his need to be loved by becoming homosexual. He goes on to suggest that the black son's anxiety toward the matriarch that instilled in him a dread fear of all women so that he may become psychologically castrated and is unable to have genuine sexual feelings towards another woman, while the black woman became a completely independent, competent, and aggressive female. So, by the 1970s, the response to the Moynihan Report constituted what might be termed a kind of social science regime of the denial of queerness and a kind of an assertion of black heteronormativity. So the pioneering black sociologist Robert Staples, for example, acknowledged the problems of white supremacy and black masculinity, arguing that to act as a man in a society which fears his masculinity, the black male was subject to the force of brute white retaliation. The black mother had to constantly live with the realization that her son might be killed for exercising the prerogatives of manhood. But Staples made an objective to Moynihan and main purpose in a number of articles that he writes after 1970 or so was to, on the one hand, acknowledge the various, quote, sociological and psychological studies which purport to show how black males are demasculinized and may in fact be latent homosexuals. And in a 1971 anthology, Staples observed that many black males lack a consistently present male figure with whom to identify and from whom to learn essential components for a male role, and that one conclusion may be that they are latent homosexuals. In another piece, he acknowledges that although not all men are super studs after the sexual revolution, there was a significant incidence of homosexuality, impotence, premature ejaculation. Now he begins to talk in terms of a diminished masculinity being linked to sexual dysfunctions, and in a way, acknowledging these sexual dysfunctions, it essentially takes the question of homosexuality and it makes it, people don't argue that it's not in the African American community. I mean, there's a perception that maybe people say, oh, black people are gay. It was more of this, in an attempt to normalize the family and to say that there is no pathology in response to the Moynihan Report. There was a kind of it was a making of homosexuality and designating that as an illness, as a pathology, in a new way and in a more pervasive way. And actually, in a way, going against the trends of more liberalization in white social science. And it's to see this kind of defense of the community and this silence on the question of homosexuality at the same time, and that is everywhere in the new kind of black social science in the late 60s and 70s. So the third iteration of black pathology concerns this documentary Portrait of Jason by the independent filmmaker Shirley Clarke. And Portrait of Jason is about Jason Holliday, alias for Aaron Payne. And what we know about him remains limited to his own biographical statement, which he penned on stationery from the Hotel Chelsea, the Manhattan home of Shirley Clarke. Payne, or Holliday, had grown up in Trenton, New Jersey. His mother was from Newark, and he later left for New York to become a star in the theater, or so he intended. He apparently dropped out of the local business college and claims to have been part of the dance troupe of Katherine Dunham, among other artistic endeavors. Little else is known about him. He related his aspirations to be an entertainer, getting his start. Quote, in his biography, he talks about working in the whorehouses and saloons of Trenton. And the only other thing we know about this subject that we're going to see is that, or at least that I've been able to find, is that he died at the age of 76 in New York. But about the director, we know a lot. Her papers are extensive, and they reveal an interesting connection to Jason and to this representation of black queerness. Born to an elite Polish Jewish family and raised by servants in Manhattan, Shirley Clarke studied dance with Martha Graham and eventually retired and instead decided to make films, beginning with some important shorts that captured modernist choreography and dance. By the end of the 1950s, her work earned international recognition, including prizes from the Venice Film Festival, the Edinburgh Film Festival, and her first feature film, widely seen as both daring and innovative, The Connection, was a dark meditation on heroin addicts that earned the 1960 Critics' Prize at the Cannes Film Festival. According to an interview with Clarke's daughter, when she started to work on The Connection, she met Carl Lee, the son of black actor Canada Lee, and began to live with him. And she credits him with introducing her to Jason. At about the time that Clarke had received a donation of soon-to-expire film from a local shop, she happened to meet Jason on the street. Her daughter recalled that whenever she would see him, her mother would give him money to help him. Clarke recalled that she had known Jason on and off for years and that she felt he would, quote, dig the opportunity to do his thing before the public. They staged the film in Clarke's apartment, and the shooting lasted for some 12 hours, from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. the following morning. Just imagine, wrote Clarke, what might happen if someone was given his head and allowed to let go many consecutive hours. I was curious, and wow, did I find out. So I'll show the first clip of the performance.
I find when the heat gets to you, it's one good escape from being gay. I was grabbed one time, they're going to search you, you know. As soon as the cop touched me, I went, oh, office. And I was cool, you know. I tipped away with my thing, you know, and I found out not to hang around there anymore. But that's a good thing. Sometimes it saves you, you know, it really can save you. Go into a thing. I've also found, like, I hang out with a lot of faith and show business, you know, like I've been striving for that nightclub. And they're all very, very warm and nice for one reason. As long as the white boy finds out that you don't want to screw the white girl, then you kind of in, you know. So you're just all one big gay family together, you know. As long as they think that you're more interested in the man than in the woman, then everything is cool. So you become nice then, you know, you're safe to have around. And Jesus Christ, some of the boys, they worse than the girls, you know, and they kind of mixed up, and wow. I don't know what's going to become of those people, but I've had enough of them. So, nothing grander about Spade Queen. Oh, but you mind if I say a few words about Spade Queen? Down and squares back. If you want to know what's shaking, you got to go to the street where they got walk-in department stores. You don't have to go in the department store. Just grab a man on the phone and buy and follow some nice girl. Now you can get confused up there because some of them that looking like girls ain't girls. I mean, they got some drag queens in Harlem selling together. I mean, they coming out and they got fur coats and collars and wigs for days. And I mean, they don't slouch down the avenue like no East Side maid. These throw a tip, you know. They take over, you know. The attitude is like, let's take the thing. And they take it out the scratching heads. People say, wee! They don't feel nothing, you know. They're thrown down to their minds and they're sharp and they know where they're going. And they refer to each other as Miss Thing. Miss Thing, you gotta go. Like, I don't know why. Don't think it's so straighten up and come on. You know, we to be there. Said we were going to be there, and they would be there. Going in the parlor and sit in the box and scream at Jackie Mom Mabley saying, "Oh, what is it?" Mom said, "You know, that's Mom's children up there. Y'all a little funny, but you can't help it. You know, somebody got to give you a break." And these are the girls. These are the girls in furs and feathers, and they all get a chance to walk across the stage, and they know how to walk. Now, some of them got bad feet, and these high heels are killing them, you dig it? And they walk like they're walking on eggshells. But they that, you know. Oh, when they get downtown, you see, where they want to carry on for the white folks. Oh, this is what happens when they get downtown. They always feel that they got to get prim and proper, and they tuck in their lips. And this is what they do. Shops is killing them, you know. They want to go, ah! So bad, but they go, everybody knows a very funny story. A friend of mine, Miles Davis, working at the Vanguard. Billy Joe goes in with a blonde, passes right by Miles, doesn't speak. So somebody said, "Billy Joe didn't speak to you, Miles." Miles said, "Well, shoot, it didn't mind so much he didn't speak. And I don't care so much he met the blonde. He said, but the dude had his lips stuck in."
The film scholar Lauren Rabinovitz and other feminist scholars interviewed Clark in the 1970s and developed a feminist interpretation of the director, her work, and in a small part talked about Portrait of Jason. They argued that Clark displaced her sense of marginalization and otherness as a woman onto these scenes of urban alienation, and that the physical bodies of the social outcasts and the misfits, personified by African Americans, homosexuals, and drug addicts, three themes that Clark had taken over, that these were ways of enabling them to become part of the avant-garde film scene, and they were, quote, a way of challenging the inscription of the filmmaker's gaze as an objective reality or objective male reality. As you'll see in the next two clips, Clark utilized heavily stylized techniques of direction and editing, fading in and out, blurring, heavy sort of off-screen direction and almost interrogation, separating the audio from the visual, fading his voice out and then fading his image out. And in turn, this set a set of what I would see as kind of modernist contrasts, and an attempt to well, let me show you this clip, and then I'll show you what I mean. Let's see. And I want clip number 4.
When I was 12 years old before I knew every lesbian, pimp, whore, bulldagger in town, and I was making some coins from it, plus enjoying myself, you know, and finding out exactly what was happening, you know. And then they look at me and say, "You're queer." Oh, the people just don't know, child. They just don't know.
So that's a good example of the sort of technique that I see as if people are trying to balance between seeing, I guess Rabinovitz would say that Jason is manipulating Clark and Clark is manipulating Jason, and that it's a kind of back and forth at the same time that She is kind of pioneer. She's trying to break ground as a woman in a very much a kind of male-dominated avant-garde director or independent filmmaker and director circles. And in fact, I made this presentation a couple of weeks ago, and a person raised a comparison with Diane Arbus, the sort of I don't know if you know who she is, but she's like this, photographer of this very odd and unusual looking, and to what extent is Arbus also gaining a kind of feminist avant-garde position at the expense of these relatively powerless objects. The last thing I want to say is that about this, and maybe show one more clip, is that eventually what happens is there's a kind of forced unraveling of Jason. So on the one hand, yes, he is kind of adopting a dominant identity, a signifying identity of the 1960s of the hustler, right? And he's sort of hustling her, and he talks about being a prostitute and being a houseboy and being arrested, and he talks about going to Bellevue, and he talks about being a mental patient. So all of the sort of deviance, and throughout the film, he's being sort of plied with more and more scotch, and he's smoking marijuana, and this is all in the name of sort of getting him to expose himself, and so that we get in Clark's idea, the sort of this cinema verite. This is the true person beneath the layers. After its release, Jason contacted Clark for payment, and in response, according to her papers, she consulted an attorney because he had consulted an attorney. She sent a memo stating that in reference to my film, my agreement with Mr. Holliday is for him to receive 10% of the profits. She enclosed a statement of expenses and claimed that the film itself cost X number of dollars. Said that he would receive quarterly statements. There's no indication that he received any money or that he ever received any statements. They may not have been collected in the papers. The final point is that the response to the film was quite enormous. So there were some 50 reviews over a number of years that the film was being released. First independent film houses, and then it's rented by college campuses and film societies, and so it's constantly circulating for the next 10 years. And essentially what the reviewers say is, for example, The Nation called it one of the most daring films ever, stressing not the content but the structure. But with the exposure of Jason and the kind of triumph of the director, there was also significant ridicule. One reviewer said that Jason is ugly and was to be pitied as a strange thing, not a fellow man. Some of the reviews responded to the experimental dimension, but then viewed Jason with distaste. He was, quote, a Negro and a homosexual. Jason is a habitual actor playing the roles he must play to maintain his self-respect. According to another one, a film festival catalog, quote, it's a revelation of what being a Negro can do to this man. And in a way, you're sort of getting this sort of the Moynihan scenario full circle. The stress of ghettoization, the stress of Jim Crow domination or racism has created this man who is essentially always trying to compensate for the problems of racism. And so even Clark says that argues that the main problem is of self-identity, of dignity, and that the film, quote, that she made the film, quote, to give them a sense of pride, the idea that they are important enough to make a film about. So in the end, there are very few people, I think, who understood or could see anything of value about Portrait of Jason. In one of the few insightful readings of the man, the queer writer Allen Ginsberg described the film as, quote, the inside history of a gay Negro boyhood. And another journal said, quote, this is the last quote, like Malcolm and Stokely, referring to Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, Jason was an American product, bona fide, and, quote, a litmus test for testing out society, unquote. So that, again, I think the response to Jason ran the gamut, but I think I was struck both by the power of the filmmaker. So here she has 12 hours of film, and you see, when you go and look at the film, which you can't watch anymore, but it's like in these cans, you understand how much she had sort of cut and pasted and manipulated the performance so that you really are getting her version, in my opinion, of a kind of what she wants you to see, even as she's trying to make it appear that it's completely sort of just authentic and spontaneous. And that really, in a way, that she really sort of has the last word. And I don't think that he gets to speak outside of the pathology of the time all that particularly well. And that's, I think, a point of contention. But that's really, those are the three examples, and I'm definitely of pathology in this the kind of context we're talking about the queerness. And I'd be happy to take questions about this or other issues. Yes.
Hi. I was wondering how, maybe, I don't know if you have literature or read anything about it, or if you could take a guess. But I was wondering how black men of the time, like Malcolm X or MLK, or, I mean, really any of the Black Panthers later on, how you think that they would have reacted, or how they did react to Jason and his open homosexuality. I know that they, especially Huey P. Newton, first lectured really strongly against homosexuality, then came back and made statements to revoke that. How he may have reacted to something like Jason's black man being obviously gay.
Yeah, well, I have not seen, I have read The Black Panther, and they did not talk that much about homosexuality, and they did not see Jason, did not see Portrait of Jason, and I haven't seen. It's an interesting question because in her clippings, which is where I'm drawing the reviews from, there are not many, if any, African American periodicals, as I'm sort of thinking out loud about it. I'll have to go back and look. And I don't, there are a couple of, I think there are a couple of African American reviews. Also, it's interesting, like after the riots in Detroit, they wrote to Shirley Clark to ask if they could rent at a reduced price a copy of Portrait of Jason to raise money, which I thought was sort of an interesting level of acceptance of the Portrait of Jason. And I think there's a way that you can see him as kind of rebellious and militant, it's the question of homophobia and black power movement is kind of it's complicated. As you pointed out, there's Huey Newton, but then on the other hand, there's Eldridge Cleaver, right? And this is a very big controversy in the gay community because Eldridge Cleaver, who writes the memoir Soul on Ice, very directly attacks James Baldwin for his homosexuality. And there's just these long paragraphs of homophobia. And Soul on Ice becomes a really popular book, very kind of popular on the New Left, and then controversial in the gay press because of attacking James Baldwin. And James Baldwin never responds to it. He's asked, well, what did you feel about Soul on Ice? And he just said, I just chose to ignore Cleaver. It wasn't important to me. It was an attack, anyway. So apparently, it didn't matter. Not that it didn't matter, but this was his way of not creating more controversy around it. And it's also, I was just giving this talk with Simon Wendt in Germany, who wrote about Black Power, and it's a common perception that Black Power radicals were hyper masculine, and I think that a lot of it has to do with Cleaver, and some of it has to do with the performativity of a kind of militancy. But there's not a great concern with homophobia. And what I'm saying here, with looking at the response to the Moynihan report, is the kind of normativity and the homophobia happens a lot among Black academics, Black Power academics, Black sociologists, Black people who are Black intellectuals in a way. Yeah.
What do you do with the second part of the new Malcolm X biography? I mean, in terms of your scholarship.
Well, he's referring to this new biography by Manning Marable that is very clear that Malcolm X was perhaps bisexual, and that he, in order to make ends meet in the 1940s and 50s, he would have to have relationships, massages, and so forth with other men. And I know that Marable, who recently died, was talking a lot about this and was lecturing. I didn't attend any of the lectures, but I heard secondhand that he took a certain amount of flack for it because clearly Malcolm X is a figure has become constructed as a figure for Black nationalists and of Black urban masculinity, and people did not want to hear about his homosexuality, I would say. I mean, I haven't seen a lot of press on this, but I do know that that when he talked about it, it stirred controversy, definitely. And it's also well known. So I've been teaching this about Malcolm X, the hustler, for 20 years because there were biographies that were not as well researched, but were clearly correct. And this is what Marable said: is that these people who have been marginalized are right. He was having sex with men. He was accepting money for sex. But obviously it's not mentioned in the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is the standard way of talking about Malcolm X. And so even the way that he's been taught has always always ignored and silenced that. Yeah.
Actually, I have two questions. The first is really short. Did Clark give the film at a reduced rate so they could be used as a fundraiser?
I didn't see. I just saw the request. She always claimed to be losing money, so I'm not sure if she did or not. I think she wrote back and offered a negotiated price, but maybe not the whole price, and I don't know what finally happened. Yeah.
My second question is, okay, so first you talk about jets, and then your second example is what's going on mostly within the social sciences.
Yeah, except the Moynihan report is in the newspapers, and it's in Newsweek.
My question is how that gets picked back up in JET, and does JET also take this sort of new respectability approach coming out of Moynihan and social sciences, or does it still exist? I don't know.
Well, an interesting point is that I would say that, I have yet to do this, but if you plotted all of the articles on homosexuality in JET from 1951 to 1970, you would see that they're decreasing coverage. And I can't find out if it's an editorial policy because the Johnson Publishing Company doesn't really speak to scholars. So you can call them up and all day long and nobody will just get an answering machine, you can email them. And I am assuming that there's a kind of respectability. And there's an article in the American Quarterly that makes the argument that with the civil rights movement, and particularly Martin Luther King's, the idea that you needed to be very deserving to needed to be sort of hyper-respectable, perfectly groomed, very deserving, in order to be received civil rights in the 1950s and the 1960s. And that the way that Bayard Rustin, the black gay organizer, shunted off to the side after the March on Washington and is not welcome in leadership circles because he's gay and he's been arrested and everyone knows he's gay, and the Southerners are threatening to expose his gayness to hurt the movement, so he agrees to kind of be on the sidelines. And that's an extreme example, but I do think that generally speaking, that there is this this idea of the kind of minister and the kind of dressing up in your best suit to go sit at a lunch counter to protest segregation as a kind of spectacle of sort of being deserving, and that you couldn't imagine, that you couldn't have that sort of queer presentation at the same time.
Yeah, because you talk about Stonewall so much, I was wondering also a little bit what is the influence of all this sort of black power, black civil rights movement of Jason on Stonewall and the gay movement in the end?
Yeah, I mean, it was more. It's definitely more of a one-way thing where gay liberation and gay rights activists are inspired by the civil rights movement and by the Black Power movement. And they are they're often used in all different kinds of ways. The example of rights making and protest to understand the emergence of to organize and to articulate gay rights, and it's just from at the level of just sort of discourse to the level of literally organizing rights. I have an article in the Journal of American History that came out this summer that is all about that's about the passage of a gay rights ordinance in Philadelphia. But this gay rights ordinance was essentially just adding the word gay to a set of laws that were championed by the Black Northern Civil Rights Movement. But in the process, it becomes very complicated because then African American conservatives turn out at these city council hearings to deny that there's a comparison between the experience of race and the experience of gay liberation, and that in many of these states, all the city after city after city, the attempt to pass a gay rights ordinance fails, and often the Catholic Church and because of white ethnic resentment, but also because of these kind of unlike race arguments. So there's deep connections both ways. It's inspiring for gay rights organizers, and also people are trying to limit what the civil rights movement means. It's not, it doesn't extend to other groups. Yeah.
So in other words, do you see that as a result of possible competition? Fear of competition?
I do think it's fear of, like, the newcomer at City Hall. Yeah, a new block of voting power in cities, and that's definitely one factor. And then what works is, at least in the case of Philadelphia, is when people try to reach out across communities. And often what they're very clever is that they say, oh, well, let's get a black gay man to testify for the gay rights measure. And it becomes harder to, at that moment, say, oh, well, race and sexuality are not the same when a black gay man says, but I experience these in similar ways and intersecting ways. And it's kind of a symbolic use, but it can be very effective. Yeah.
You mentioned about hypermasculinity. I wonder whether the homosexuality associated with femininity and whether it is more pathologized than the homosexuality itself.
I mean, that's a really good question. I think that I am trying to do more work on masculinity in this, and I don't have a great answer because I don't see it that much in the sources. I know that that in the gay movement as a whole, the more feminine gay people, the transgender people, are claiming that there's a lack of acceptance, and that and then there's like this kind of clone masculinity that emerges, sort of hyper masculinity. But in terms of black gay discourse, there is not necessarily there's not necessarily a distinction. One thing and also I would say that there's a tendency, there's an acknowledgement that black men become eroticized, and so that they're usually very masculine. So if you read pulp pornography novels, right, the black men are always sort of super studs and the tops and the aggressors, and you don't often see two people of color, a black man with a black man, until later on. It's always, at least in the pulp novels and some of the early pornography that I've looked at, it's always black tops and white bottoms.
Yeah. Related question.
Yeah.
Do you see a change because what you just described about what's happening in Philadelphia is like that they use the discourses of the civil rights movement in the gay movement and dominant framing and action repertoires. But didn't it lead to more racial cross-cutting relations between people as well? So do you see there is a kind of, what you say in English, that they get closer and mixing more after Stonewall, or was this already before? So was there kind of whatever minorities time thought also before Stonewall?
Yeah, I think that I think there's definitely more coalitions. Certainly in Philadelphia, there are a series of African American mayors, and they are into the 1980s, and they clearly are attempting to recruit people from the gay community to be on councils or to be advisors. But so ask the second part of your question again. So that on the level of municipal politics, in some cases, and we'll learn more as more research emerges, it's clear that the experience of going to fight for rights and engaging what are now black majority metropolises and often black-run cities, gay people become engaged with African American politics, and that must impact the way that they see themselves as a political group. But then, in terms of is there integrated club life, and I don't really know that much yet about that. It's kind of going to be a question of oral history for the 60s, and the gay newspapers are really starting in the 70s, and maybe there's guides. I know that there are lots of gay bars, black gay bars, and there's increasing numbers of black gay bars in Philadelphia that people, local archivists have been able to map out by using tourist guides. And the gap is, I think, doing oral histories to see where people are integrated or where people are in particularly black neighborhood bars.
Can I ask a question? Sure. So I find it very sad, this junction between these ideals of gay men who show in their pornography always black studs, and at the same time, so I guess the images you show of James, and I guess of James Baldwin, so I guess the gay men in the black community themselves are always more effeminate. And if you look at the drag balls is also about effeminacy and about queens and about fairies, and it's not about this hyper-masculine. It's not a little bit. I guess it's so weird to see that the gay men, they look for the white gay men, look for the masculine black guys, while the black effeminate guys are completely overlooked or perhaps only available for, I would say, this kind of movies.
Yeah, I mean, it could be also who is maybe the effeminate black gay men are more likely to identify as gay than the masculine gay men, or more likely to be, performing in these roles in a public way. And but it's definitely true that I've read these plain novels, and it's always the pictures are this way, and this kind of very very super stud hypermasculine black body image is pervasive, and you don't see in the pornography smaller, or at least I haven't in the stuff that I've looked at, sort of smaller bodies, and kind of, like I say, it's sort of the black bottom. There's a prison culture too, and that is probably more varied. So another major place where black homosexuality is in growing rates of incarceration. And there, I suppose that I've certainly read stories, and Regina Kunzel's book mentions this as well, is that she, I think, sees that too, is that black men are often positioned as the tops in this very kind of role-oriented social order. But you also see black bottoms, or effeminate black men who are sort of kept and so forth within these cultures.
What you just said made me think of the character of Lafayette in True Blood. I don't know if you've ever watched that series.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, these two representations of black queerness may not be completely contradictory with one another. They may also correspond to. They may also be merged or correspond to different facets of characters that could be one.
Yeah.
So, but if you haven't seen the series.
But also I'm wondering who is, I always assume that pornography is being created by whites, and they have power over the representations, and it's being sold at maybe through the mail, but also in white pornography stores. So I kind of wonder about that. I mean, it's hard to find out. Most of these books are anonymous, and the magazines, the early magazines are, they're just pictures, and they have stories, but they're like pseudonyms, so it's hard to track down concrete information on if the authors are white or black, or who exactly is consuming this, to understand the racial types. Yeah.
So we have this Gloria Becker in Holland, who discusses always black mate or lesbian relations in Suriname. And so if you discuss the African family, it's always very interesting that she's saying what you see in Suriname and the Caribbean area also very often, that you have also this African family where the man is always absent, or he's not present at least, and sometimes he gives money, but she says also you have, I would say, this is an African family. It's also, as she very much, she romanticized a little bit, but at the same time she says they're also very effective in raising children. So she makes it, instead of a negative image of a family without a father, into a much more interesting family that Burks had, because his father is also a little bit absent in our societies. Because she's saying that there's always two or perhaps even three mothers, and then she makes also a connection immediately to lesbianism, in the sense that these women also, they have perhaps sex with men at some point, but I guess the better sex and the greater love is with women. So do you find also this kind of image in your material, in this Jet, for example?
I don't see it in Jet, but it definitely is part of the Moynihan controversy, because when the controversy goes from the newspapers to, you know, kind of popular periodicals, and then and sociologists, black sociologists, social scientists, defense, and then it sort of makes its way into the academy, and at this point, feminists take up the matriarchy thesis, and they make exactly that argument. Carol Stack and all our kin says that what you have is fictive families, in which the family is not pathological because it's matriarchal, because women are helping each other out and serving as resources, and networks of women are serving as resources in public housing projects, for example. And so the one thing that, if you read All Our Kin, which is published in 1974 and was very influential in rebutting the Moynihan thesis and saying, well, there's nothing wrong with matriarchy. Matriarchy is functional. These women are not. You know. And then black feminists say, well, why is being powerful an example of matriarchy? You know, why is being empowered and independent? Why is that labeled as somehow damaging and pathological? But the interesting thing that happens is that this whole question that's very alive in 1966 about, is the emasculated boy, is the home without the father, is that a queer home, right? And that, in the process of defending against that and denying that, the whole question of homosexuality is completely lost. And so even in 2009, they had a 40th anniversary of the Moynihan Report at Harvard University, and all these social scientists come in, and they're all talking about the Moynihan Report, and there's not one word about homosexuality. And it's fascinating because at the time, it was obvious. It was obvious, and it was clear that that was an implication. And then, you know, so that the space for even thinking about black queer youth is completely abandoned and emptied out, and it's just this, you know, it's kind of a race relations project.
And lesbianism.
The lesbianism, she doesn't say that there's lesbianism in the extended networks, and there's not a lot of work on by black lesbians or about black lesbians outside the literature. It's kind of it's at its beginning stages in the U.S.
I have a question on Jason's position in the transformation of black masculinities in the United States. I think we saw a portrayal of a person who very actively invalidates, resists the status quo image of black masculinity. Is he a lone wolf? Or are you able to say, no, he's a member of a family or maybe a queer dynasty that was already working before Stonewall and still is going on? Because I'm an outsider, but it reminds me a little bit to Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
It reminds me to this, these people. Paris Burning, of course. These are the signals that you get out of the scene if you're not a member of it. So in the white masculinity, it's also, since 1800, we have a very active counter history of men, often lonely wolves, who use their personality to give a different image of masculinity. The dandies are a very famous example, but many more. So are you able already to write a chapter in your book on now the great history of irritating black queer mess?
Well, the thing I have to ask you is that, you know, is to me, Jason is not sort of a drag queen, and he's not a kind of an invert. He's not performing a feminine role. I mean, he's very clearly a man. He's wearing a suit. His mannerisms are a bit extraordinary and exaggerated, but they're not female. And so I think he is kind of an interesting figure that he's both masculine and homosexual. And I think in the Jet edition conception of the homosexual, it was kind of blurred. It was a mix-up of the impersonator and the drag queen and the these sort of famous stories of people who had lived, men who had lived as wives for 10 years or 20 years in the pictures that went along with them, and that was a very dominant conception of that the homosexual acted as a woman, and I don't think that Jason does that.
But do you consider him a case of protest masculinity or marginal masculinity?
Yeah.
I agree he's not drag queen.
Yeah, I think that he is. I think he's a hustler. I think he's just trying to. I think he's trying to. That's his labor, and he's trying to get ahead. And he's wondering if this performance will get him more public attention, and another line, another way to advance his career. And I don't think he is a protester. I think I should maybe consider that. That this is not. It's not a civil rights tradition. And I was trying to suggest that in terms of a politics of respectability. And he's not respectable. He clearly is being. He doesn't perform that role. He's not a hero. He's more of an anti-hero. So I don't think he's very political beyond that kind of.
But it's made very political by James Baldwin and Cleaver, who say that Baldwin is an effeminate homosexual.
Yeah.
There it's very prominent, the charge of effeminacy. And he's not neither he's not a drag queen, he's not an impersonator, he's simply a gay man.
Yeah. I mean, and because he writes about his novels, talking about bisexuality and talking about homosexuality, and they're very popular. Mm-hmm. And so he has, and because they're in the popular mind, and it's a black man who is bisexual and suicidal and so forth, it's a figure that Cleaver particularly dislikes, and so he then attacks Baldwin because of it. For writing this and for portraying this. Yeah.
Yeah, but can you relate into this long history of men who deserts this hypermasculinity, who invalidated Quentin Crisp is another one in white masculinity. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't have to do with the drag queen, but it comes with this dynamic history of masculinity. You have these people who step out of it, and I think you can write a very interesting chapter on.
Yeah.
So for me, when I look at this man, I do not see a very specific case. I see a person who fits very well into a frame.
Yeah, I mean, I
marginalize yourself.
Yeah, but I agree, because I think that he is expressing a subculture. I don't think that's like this clip. He's talking about these drag queens and snap queens. We had thought that the snap queen was something that was Marlon Riggs, right? That happened in 1991 or whatever. It's fun to see this in 1967 and portrayed as kind of organic to the Harlem subculture and drag queens and the Harlem subculture. It's very without any. That's just part, in Canada Lee is, just saying, or Carl Lee is just saying, just tell me that story again, tell me about this, and so that this is part of it. But it's odd because Shirley Clark again is looking for what she is perceiving as the outrageous and the unknown and the shocking, and it is received as shocking and by the mainstream. So it's not as tame as Baldwin.
Thank you very much.
Man.